All right. Hey, everyone. Welcome to another installment of our UVA speaker series. We're very excited today to have a relatively new member of the UVA family, a member of the family in law, I guess, right? Because your son is at UVA as a second year now, Michael. We have Mike Jower, who is an author, published author, and contributor to periodicals, among which Psychology Today. Um, and Mike is going to talk about some of his recent books, but also specifically a topic called thick and thin boundaries, and how maybe understanding those boundaries in ourselves and others can help us navigate the world more effectively. Does that sound right, Mike?
That's exactly it. Yep.
Well, Mike, can you introduce yourself, do a better job of introducing yourself than I did, and share sort of how you got to where you are today?
No, you've done great, Fraser, and I appreciate it. Appreciate meeting you, and by extension, everybody else who's watching. Yeah, my son is a second-year student. He is interested. We were talking about sociology, politics, business. So his interests are fairly broad, and so are mine. We live here in Vienna, Virginia, and I've been studying individual differences and personality differences, and especially relating to emotion, different styles that people have of reacting and acting to things that happen to them, the emotional core of who we are for about 25 years. I've blogged for Psychology Today for, I guess, coming up on 10 years or so. I've been able to publish 3 books, which I think all have emotion in the title, or at least the subtitle. I've had a chance to contribute articles to Scientific American online and a variety of different journals and magazines, spirituality and health. So it's been a great adventure for me. It's all sort of a sideline, actually. I work in public affairs, and do consulting with the federal government. So this is entirely stuff that's, I guess, constitutes graduate work if I were to go for a degree for it. But literally, I've been up to this kind of exploration for about the past 25 years.
Well, and so when did you stumble on, discover, create the concept of the thick and thin boundaries?
It's a great question. I came upon it through a nice suggestion that somebody made that I had reached out to. At that time, Fraser, I was working with the US EPA, not on staff, but I was helping them develop guidance for private sector building owners and managers. And eventually we carried that over to public sector buildings as well, civilian side of the federal government, and to combat so-called sick building syndrome, keep buildings healthy, keep occupants healthy. And I realized that people were complaining about so-called sick buildings, and they complained about other things as well. And it seemed like their concerns about the buildings in many cases predated their being in the buildings. And I was interviewing these folks and trying to make sort of heads or tails of how a building can come to be labeled a so-called sick building, and people complain about it. And I started to notice similarities in the kinds of statements people were giving me about what it was like to work in that building, and sort of their personality, if you will, and what they paid attention to and what affected them maybe more than other people. And I started to just get interested in this just because it seemed intriguing to me, more than the sort of building engineering problem of the duct work and the ventilation and the source control in the building, which we were also addressing. And I started doing some reading, and eventually I think somebody connected me, or at least told me about Ernest Hartman, who was a professor at that time at Tufts University, and his concept of thick and thin boundaries, and the extent to which certain people are more affected by external stimuli. Stuff gets to them more than other people. I'll give you one example. The one thing that gets to me, I suppose, more than anything else, is if I'm in a movie theater, which during COVID, there's not a lot of that. But when we used to go to movie theaters, the smell of buttered popcorn, I find just appalling. But that's about it. And I can manage well enough, unless the person is sitting basically right around me to watch the movie and put that sort of out of my mind. But I found that people in these so-called sick building situations, they were very much driven by their senses and by their feelings about the external environment. And that's what led me to Ernest Hartman. And I corresponded with him, eventually met up in a suburb of Boston, and got to know him a little bit and have tremendous respect for his work and his legacy, which I believe is severely underrated. And Fraser, probably the majority of what I've done since then is sort of to make the wider world aware of his contributions as a psychiatrist and as a man of the world, and somebody who I think really identified a key characteristic and key differentiator between different types of people.
And so it sounds like, so are we saying that people who have thin boundaries are more sensitive and people who have thick boundaries are less sensitive? I mean, is that close to what we're talking about? I mean, it's fascinating that you'd have people that are just, you know, that are much more responsive, much more sensitive to things that are going on in the building. And then they're, of course, pointing the fingers and saying, the building's a problem, right? It needs to be fixed, whereas other people presumably don't get bothered by it at all. Is that a fair assessment of what?
Yeah, that's you've hit the nail on the head. Absolutely right. And Hartman published his first book on boundaries in the mid 90s. Actually, no, I think it was before that. It was in the mid 80s. I got to know his work in the mid 90s, and then later on. And it's really the difference, as you say, between people's level of sensitivity to what their sense of vulnerability, their sense of self-containment versus being open to other influences. Highly thick boundary people you might consider rigid or stolid on that far side of the spectrum. Highly thin boundary people you might consider sort of flaky or messy on that side of the spectrum. Most people are somewhere in the middle. So you have highly thick boundary people, highly thin boundary people, and the majority of us are somewhere in the middle. It's you know, the traditional bell curve is really sort of describes where people fall. There are certain trends that Hartman and his colleagues identified, which hold up over time. Women, interestingly, tend to be, on the whole, thinner boundary than men. And we tend to get thicker boundary as we get older, as you might expect, a little more set in our ways, a little more sedentary, and solidify our expectations as far as what the world is about and things like that. Also, certain professions seem to traffic more in thick boundary versus thin boundary people, so that the highly thin boundary people are the most imaginative and creative people. They're in the arts, you know, that's the predominant profession for highly thin boundary people. Highly thick boundary people who sort of thrive on consistency and predictability and laws and sort of standards, as opposed to breaking those standards and breaking conventions. You'd have thicker boundary people in the sciences, in law, and in business for the most part. And it's going to vary individual by individual, because if nothing else, I think Hartman was conscious that everyone is a unique person. So mileage is going to vary, but there are some general trends that have held up in his research, not only by him, but by others to corroborate it.
So I feel like I'm maybe drawing the wrong conclusion when I say that it means sensitive, because it sounds like you're saying that somebody who is fixed in their ways, somebody who is inflexible or rigid or stubborn, or let's say rigid, that person I would think of being very sensitive, very overly sensitive to stimulation, right? And so, but it sounds like that's a thin can you help me understand if I sort of gone off the rails in terms of understanding?
No, not at all. I think maybe a good way to sort of frame it is there are other personality characteristics that are associated with thick and thin boundaries. there's something called the Big Five personality traits, which has sort of been blessed by the National Institutes for Health and researchers associated with NIH. One of those traits is openness to experience. And the strongest correlation among the Big Five traits is that one. So to the extent a person is open to new experience and really thrives on it, versus being sort of closed-minded or comfortable with where they're at and not wanting to give credence to other points of view or other ways of doing things, that's the thick boundary approach. So this plays out, and this is kind of my predominant interest, this plays out in all aspects of society and the issues that we grapple with as a society, whether it's immigration, whether it's rights and accommodations for transgender people. It could be something as, I remember back maybe last summer when Naomi Osaka withdrew from the Wimbledon tournament. She was accused of being overly sensitive. And I think Serena Williams came to her defense and said, well, you know, she's got to take care of herself. Some of us are thicker skinned versus thinner skinned. And she's a thinner person than I am. So I'm going to respect her for making that judgment as far as pulling out of the tournament and kind of protecting her own health and mental health and so forth. That became a controversy that for a while. Did she have the right to do that? We also see thick and thin, this sort of push and pull playing out in the arts, in entertainment, you know, edgy humor, edgy fashion. Where do you draw the line? We hear those kinds of phrases. This is too edgy for me, or this is pushing that boundary. It's pushing the envelope. These turns of phrase really reflect on people's comfort level, where they choose to draw the line, what they believe to be moral, immoral, understandable, outrageous, permissible, or not. It's really conditioned, I believe, by our inherent sense of where we ourselves, each one of us, draws that line.
Well, it's interesting too, because presumably you can have somebody who is very open to new experiences in one area and very, very rigid in another area immediately. So it's not a situation where it permeates or extends throughout their entire experience. I mean, I'm just thinking about somebody might feel themselves very open politically or socially, but be very rigid as to what they feel is, you know, like we're saying, in terms of edgy or if something's controversial. Now,
you're absolutely right. And Hartman recognized that, and I appreciate you mentioning, because I should add that even though this framework, I think, illuminates a lot in our society and in our own personal lives, Hartman recognized that no one person is completely thick or completely thin. You know, we have multitudes within us, and his concept actually constitutes 12 subcategories of thick to thin. So one, for example, is clothing, and sort of an aesthetic sense of how we clothe ourselves and how we decide what's fashionable or what's not. So I think he has one category called lines and clothing. He has another one for dreams, because the way he got started with this, interestingly enough, was he studied people that had nightmares, that were prone to nightmares. And those were the thinnest boundary people. Those were people for whom their unconscious concerns were kind of erupting during the night, waking them up in scary ways. And so the boundary, if you will, between unconscious and conscious was being violated, and they weren't getting very good sleep. So he's got one category to sleep and dreaming. He's got another category for domestic and foreign, for example, what we view as kind of acceptably similar to ourselves versus foreign. So he's got, you know, these 12 subcategories, and people can score and do, you know, varying places from thick to thin in those 12 categories, but overall, they'll have a boundary score which places them in general thicker or thinner.
So what, we alluded to the spousal survey. What is the, what insights does one get, or what strategies can one use, or what is the value of knowing what somebody else's, yours or somebody else's thin or thick spectrum level is? Like, what can you do with it? I want to use it to make sure that I'm not getting into a fight with my wife or with my kids, or something like that. Are there some practical applications that can inspire people to learn more about the thick and thin boundaries?
I want to answer that question two ways. First, yes, in our personal life, it's certainly handy to know how the other person has scored. And typically, and I've done plenty of book talks that bear this out, when spouses take or partners take the quick boundary quiz, and Hartman had a distillation, I should say, of his 145 item full boundary questionnaire, which takes quite a bit of time to complete. He distilled the key elements down to 18. So you can take the 18 question quiz, which is actually on my website. It's youremotionaltype.com. And folks can take that 18 question quiz. It's automatically scored. And within about 10 minutes, they can find out approximately where they are in this overall measure of boundaries. So it's very helpful to recognize how different we all are. And what we find quite routinely is that if one spouse is on the thick side of the spectrum, the other is almost sure to be on the thin side of the spectrum, and vice versa. Opposites sort of complement in that way, and it makes sense. That's kind of how we look for the right person, is someone to counterbalance, who we are ourselves. But I think more broadly, when we're at work, and also as we assess the political issues that are roiling our society right now, especially this dichotomy or perceived dichotomy between red and blue, and between urban and rural, and between progressive and conservative, we're hardly able to talk to each other in any kind of civil way in this country anymore. And that is a problem. There is a very practical problem for how we run our society and our standing in the world, our ability to address issues that affect everybody in this country. And I'm of the mind that if people understand that differences are okay and they're natural, and in fact, we're all somewhere along this boundary spectrum, just as we're all along other spectrums of introverted versus extroverted. There are ways that we're all different, but we all have to get along. We have to be able to speak to each other and to work with each other productively, and not just say, well, what that person said or did, that's appalling, that's awful, that disgusts me, and never deal with them. That is a surefire recipe for divisiveness, and we seem to be heading that way. So in my work in the last several years, especially, I've tried to emphasize, Fraser, the importance of understanding boundaries as something that oddly enough, or ironically, can bring us together, in the sense that we recognize vive la différence. We're all different, but we're all human beings, and we need to try to understand each other, and not just blow each other off because we have differences of opinion, different views, different tastes. That's just the way things are, and that's because of how we're constituted as human beings.
Right. It is remarkable that we're so accommodating or understanding of people having different tastes in different things, but when it comes to conclusions, interpretations, we're very that's an indicator that the person is flawed, right? Like I don't assume that because somebody has a different taste in music, or in a different team that they root for in sports, or a different book that they like, I don't assume that they're flawed. But if they come to a different conclusion politically than I do, then I just assume they're crazy, right? Or they they're not thinking about it the right way. It is interesting. Maybe the stakes are higher because unfortunately or fortunately we live in a democratic society where if the other people come to a different conclusion, they get to impose it on us. You know, I wouldn't want them to impose their taste, their dietary tastes on me.
No,
Either.
but you know, there have been controversies. For example, the National Association, I'm sorry, the National, it's I'm trying to remember the name of the group, but it's the federal, quasi-federal organization for the humanities and for the arts. The phrase is escaping me, but you know, they fund certain pieces of art and certain artists. National Endowment for the Humanities, that's what I'm thinking of, National
Sure.
Endowment for the Arts and so forth. Those folks have gotten into trouble before because of you know, controversial pieces of art
Oh,
that they have
absolutely.
funded. So what is personal does cross the line to what is societal. And I agree with you. It's good to recognize and important for our own mental, emotional health that there are always going to be differences of opinion, and not to just, you know, blow those people off.
Right.
But it often happens that these differences in personal tastes sort of cross over into the societal and the political, and these things blow up.
Now, you had mentioned the first of the 18 categories was clothing and lines. I think you said clothing and lines. Does that mean that I can look at what somebody is wearing and evaluate whether or not they're closed-minded or open-minded?
Well, it's neatness, clothing, and lines, I believe.
Okay.
And yes, one characteristic of thinner boundary people is that the lines blur in what they're doing. It's the, you know, the traditional conception, or the standard conception of a messy desk versus an organized desk.
Mhm.
A highly thick boundary person is going to be neater. The lines between X, Y, and Z are going to be more defined, delineated. A thinner boundary person is going to move things around, and the lines get crossed a lot more. They tend to think and act more fluidly, whereas a thicker boundary person is going to be a little more orderly in the way they conduct themselves. So you might, by looking at the way a person is dressed, yeah, you might be able to infer their boundary type, at least that aspect of their boundary type.
So, Mike, would you want to show a little bit of the couples diagnostic that you have on your site? Would you like to share that?
Sure, I'd be glad to.
All right, let me make that happen here as the wizard. Here, hold on. All right, I think you are good to go right now.
All right, I've got a share screen option, so hopefully this comes up okay. So this is reflection of my second book called Your Emotional Type, that I researched and wrote with Mark Boccozzi, who has those credentials after his name and is an authority in integrative health and complementary and alternative medicine. And this focus is particularly on health and different conditions that can affect someone, and different types of integrative health approaches, complementary and alternative treatments based on a person's boundary type. But what I want to click on here is this online quiz. This shows you in visual form sort of the way someone, this boundary continuum that I mentioned, someone can be extremely thick boundary on one side, thin boundary on the other, and most of us are all somewhere here.
All right.
But here's the quiz. Now there are 18 questions, and people answer on a 0 to 4 scale. And some of the questions might strike you as a little bit out of left field. My feelings blend into one another, very close to my childhood feelings. I'm easily hurt, spend a lot of time daydreaming, fantasizing. You know, those are questions that we could probably,
Mike, let's do it. I'm ready.
Understand immediately.
Let's do it.
Scroll down for a moment, Fraser. This is what you mentioned about lines precise and clearly established. An organization where all the lines of responsibility are precise and clearly established is not one I would value. Is number 6. Place for everything in its place, and so forth. If you want to take the quiz, we could do that now. There are a couple questions towards the end that are unexpected but are helpful. So we could do this now or whatever you'd like to do.
Sure, let's do it. We'll do it.
All right.
All right. My feelings blend into one another.
So 0 indicates not at all true and 4 absolutely true.
I would say 1 for sort of true, I guess.
All right.
I am very close to my childhood feelings. I would say that is 0. Ooh, 111. Okay. All right. There.
That's extremely thin boundary. Okay.
I am easily hurt. I would say 0. I spent a lot of time daydreaming or fantasizing or in reverie. I would probably say 0. I would say I guess I'm starting to show up somewhere, huh? I dislike stories that have, I'd say 0 for 5. I'd say maybe 1 for 6.
Now, this is phrased negatively. An organization where all the lines of responsibility are precise is one I would not value.
Yeah, so I would say that I would sort of value it.
Sort of value it.
So I think that is not true of me. Maybe I'm answering it wrong. I would say that I would partially value an organization where the lines of responsibility are precise and clearly.
Partially value. Okay, so I guess let's say a 3.
Okay. There is a place for everything and everything should be in its place is not an aphorism I believe in. I would say I agree with that.
Okay, so that's a 4.
Sometimes it's scary when one gets too involved with another person.
I'm sorry, did I get that backwards? There's a place for everything and everything in its place is not an aphorism I believe in. So that is not something you believe in, or you do?
I agree with the statement, which is that it is not an aphorism I believe in.
Okay, so, oh, very well. Okay, all right, got it. I got to blame Hartman for the inverse reading.
I mean, I guess it's to make you think. Sometimes it's scary when one gets too involved with another person. I would say partially agree.
All right, let's put that as a 3.
Yeah, I don't see the answers anymore, so I'll just have to do my best here.
Okay.
A good parent has to be a bit of a child too. I would partially agree.
Partially agree. All right.
So I guess I'm at a 3.
Okay.
Number 10, I cannot easily imagine myself as an animal.
Okay. Cavalier, maybe Cavalier.
Cavalier, I think, is the guy riding the horse.
Yeah,
not the horse itself. 11, when something happens to a friend of mine or to a lover, it's almost as if it happened to me. I would say disagree.
Not so much. Not so much. I'll put a 1 in there. Okay.
All right. Number 12, when I work on a project, I don't like to tie myself down to a definite outline. I rather like to let my mind wander. I would agree strongly.
Okay, let's put a 4 there. Okay.
In my dreams, people merge into each other or become other people. No.
All right.
I believe I am influenced by forces no one can understand. I don't believe that.
Okay.
But I don't believe that because I think we can understand the forces that I'm influenced by.
Yes.
5, there are no sharp dividing lines between normal people, people with problems, and people who are considered psychotic or crazy. I would say that there are sharp dividing lines. So whatever that turns into.
Okay.
I am far from a down-to-earth, no nonsense kind of person. Boy, he really does like this inverse
yes.
language. I am far from a down-to-earth, no nonsense kind of person. I would agree with that.
Right.
7, I think I would enjoy being some kind of creative artist. I agree. And then 18, I have had the experience of someone calling me or speaking my name and not being sure whether it was really happening or whether I was imagining it. No.
Okay.
All right, how'd I do?
Okay, so 27 is your score. And that puts you a little bit on the thicker side of the boundary spectrum,
Okay.
which stands to reason. Just I wasn't doing the totals in my head here, but you did have a few questions that show that you're thinner in some respects. We were talking about some of the distinctions in those 12 categories, and that's what this is intended to get to. So you're definitely in the middle range, which most of us are.
All right.
And incidentally, I am also slightly on the thicker side of the spectrum myself. But that's incidentally a question that I tend to get when I do the book talks. I guess I can stop sharing the screen at this point.
Sure. Yep.
It's a fairly frequent question, Fraser. People will say, well, you know, I'm definitely the thinner person in this relationship, and I'd like to develop a little thicker skin. How do I do that? Or someone will say, I'm really thinner than I'd like to be. I ruminate more on things that people have said and done and take it personally. And I feel more sensitive and vulnerable than I would like to. What can I do? Can I change my boundary, my place on the boundary spectrum? Can I move that needle a little bit? And that was a question that Hartman got a lot. And the answer is yes, you do change and can change. We are not fixed 100%. However, constitutionally, it's unlikely that we're going to flip a switch or magically just transform ourselves into a completely different kind of person. But we can cultivate habits or approaches that will move us a little bit more towards the center.
No, that's very interesting. And I'll be interested to have my wife do the evaluation as well and see where we would match up.
My guesstimate is she's going to be an equivalent place on the thin side of the spectrum, but everybody's different. I imagine every couple is going to differ, so that it'll be fun though.
No, that's great. That's great. Mike, I really appreciate you taking the time to chat. And if people want to explore more, they can go to youremotionaltype.com.
That is one website I could suggest when it comes to taking the boundary quiz and relating the results to health, which is where Dr. Mukosey comes in. But I would say overall, Fraser, I would direct people to michaeljawer.com, michaeljawer.com, which provides the broadest overview of the 3 books and the range of work that I've done on boundaries and on personality.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. And listen, please extend congratulations and good luck to your son as he is moving through the university, and hopefully he'll have success with his next step, moving into the comm school.
Thank you. And your daughter as well, who I gather is in her first year.
Yeah.
And if we had a time machine, I would want Thomas Jefferson to take the boundary quiz and see where he ended up.
Perfect. Great talking to you, Mike.
Same here. Take care.
Talk to you.
Bye now.
Bye.